Hello, Rebels. Welcome to The Base. Make sure you sign up for this podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. The recall is fast approaching. We've got all the best news and analysis. You got to spread the word, sign up, and make sure you join us every episode. Today, Kristen Garcia-Dumont is with me, and our guest is Jennifer Horn. She is host of The Morning Answer and the Jen and Don Show on AM 590 and AM 870, The Answer. All right, Jennifer, come on then. What's going on with this recall? What's the latest?
Oh, Steve, it is so exciting in California. As you know, the pushback is on, right? The boomerang went so far to the left that now we are pushing back. And as much as Governor Newsom wants to call it a recall of Trump supporters, a recall of extremists, of white supremacists, this is a recall from everybody in California: Democrats, independents, Republicans, Hispanics, whites, blacks, Asians. Everybody seems to be behind this. And it's because Gavin Newsom has failed. In fact, it's really interesting to watch him campaign against the recall, guys, because he can't talk about any of his accomplishments. All he can do is try to tell you what kind of conspiracy theory is behind, or who might be behind the recall.
Yeah, and he seems to even have the press behind him, too. I mean, these hit pieces on Larry Elder from the LA Times are just, you're doing something right when the Los Angeles Times is coming at you like that.
You know, it's really interesting. I don't think that they really took how much Larry Elder could shake up this race into account. Now you have Gavin Newsom talking about the recall, acknowledging it. He's saying Larry Elder's name. All of his friends, all of his cronies in the mainstream news media are coming out against Larry Elder. I couldn't believe the headlines just from this past weekend alone. If you're looking at the LA Times opinion section, it was, he's a white supremacist. He's brandishing weapons at people. He's, he's doing all sorts of things. He said the N-word anything they can find, they are throwing at Larry Elder. And the truth is that Gavin Newsom only has himself to blame. The media only have themselves to blame. They've been providing Gavin Newsom with a lot of cover for his failings in California. And this is not just a pandemic thing, guys. This is failings of Gavin Newsom from the beginning. Homelessness didn't pop up during the pandemic. The problems with the economy, gas prices, these are things that were just made worse by his hypocritical leadership style during the pandemic.
But it's interesting to me watching it because when we were, I totally agree with everything you're saying. And if you think about the trajectory of it, so we've had, when it first started, it was totally dismissed, going back, whatever it was, a year and a half or more, a bunch of crazy people, this is never going to happen. And then when you had the French Laundry thing, suddenly, like the massive explosion in the numbers of signatures they were collecting, people just couldn't believe the hypocrisy, although anyone who really knows these elitist kind of San Francisco Bay Area Democrats, like I know them pretty well, would totally expect that kind of hypocrisy because that's who they are. You just saw it this weekend with Pelosi in that sort of fancy fundraiser in Napa where, they're lecturing everyone about masks, and there they are, just being served by all the kind of people where only the people serving them were wearing masks. They're all sitting there, enjoying their kind of fancy lunch and raising money for Democrats. So we know that they're hypocrites. The French Laundry thing, had real liftoff for the signature collection. And then it qualified. And then it seemed to me the timing, I was just a little bit anxious about it because the timing felt like, this could help Newsom, and in fact, they brought it forward because you had the state reopening, all the frustrations about the school closures and small business closures, all that kind of stuff felt like that wasn't so much front of people's minds and that he might get away with it. That's what it felt like for a few months. And then that just seemed to turn about a month ago. What do you think it was? Do you think it was Larry entering the race? Do you think it's the reminding everyone about the Delta variant and the new kind of round of, the mask mandates and whatever, reminding people about all that? What do you think it is? It definitely feels like it's changed again in a good direction, but in the last few weeks.
I definitely think the momentum's picking up. I mean, I've been saying all along on my morning show in Los Angeles, you're not seeing any rallies to save Gavin Newsom. You're only, the momentum is behind this recall. And so I think, yes, it has changed again, but I think people are waking up to a broader scope, right? I mean, you have a lot of things happening all at the same time. You have crime that's on the rise. You have these crazy DAs like you have in San Francisco, like I have in Los Angeles, who are funded by George Soros, who are pushing far left agendas that are making Californians not safe. You have the schools failing. You have parents who woke up for the very first time and realized what their kids were actually being taught in school during the pandemic, because school was in their living room. And so for the first time, they paid attention to the curriculum. And this isn't parents' fault. It's just they woke up to it. And so all of this is happening at the same time, and it spells really bad timing for Gavin Newsom. And I think California is acutely aware of the fact that Sacramento, and by the way, Democrats in general don't really want to solve problems. They want to keep the problems coming, because if there are no problems, they can't grow government. And I really feel like this is not just something that's going on in California. I feel like this is something that just average Americans are waking up to. It's that populist piece that I think President Trump was able to tap into, where it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican, you just don't trust that the government really wants to make your life any better. And so people are pushing back. We have recall fever in California. I mean, we're focused on the DAs and the governor, but there are city council recalls. There are recalls all throughout the state.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I was gonna say, can I add one thing to that, which is, I think the answer is schools. So people got very complacent over the summer. He seemed to be opening everything up. And I think people were going to give him a pass of, look, you got to, something lit a fire, and Gavin's opening up the state. He's going to open up the schools. Masks are coming off. He's seeming like that reasonable gentleman that we all liked before. So people were going to say, okay, he doesn't need to be recalled. But then we started again with, maybe the schools won't close, right? These big donations from these special interest groups. And now I think parents again are saying, okay, now we're just waiting. He's going to close down those schools eventually. He's just going to wait until after the recall. And I think that fired people up. And I think you're right. Latinos and moms are going to get this guy recalled.
Right, that's a whole interesting thing there. Let's talk about that in a second. I also want to put on the agenda for us to get to later the wildfire issue. There was news on that today with the state legislature just sort of canceling its kind of oversight hearing on how Newsom has handled that, just to try and protect him. So we'll get to that in a second. But Jennifer, I want to ask you about this. Just the point you're making is so interesting because of the. And you started with it as well. And you say we got this whole movement now in California. It's so interesting because all the political data you look at would just say to you, the recall doesn't really have a chance. If you look at the numbers last time for Newsom versus John Cox, it was like 62%, 38, I think. And then the party registration, there's an overwhelming balance in favor of Democrats. You look at the congressional districts, you look at all these numbers, the sort of classic political indicators, and you say it's such an uphill struggle, and yet it feels like this is really going to happen. So do you think that whole Democratic identification that people had in California, we're Democrats, we're California, was all very thin? It wasn't a deeply held set of views.
I think California, we should be under no grand illusions, is a very blue state, the bluest state in the entire country. And it's really important to note that we haven't had a Republican holding a statewide office since Arnold Schwarzenegger left. But one thing I know is, growing up, being born and raised in California, is that we love a recall. Recalls, for some reason, they excite people. I don't know if it's our superhero cape that comes out the back or something. We feel like we can do something. And so we do like a recall in California. But I think what's happening is more of that boomerang effect that we started with, where things are kind of coming back. We've pushed so far, and these policies are so clearly not working. And again, this has nothing to do with politics. This is about quality of life issues. These policies are failing. And then we see the hypocrisy where the rest of us in California are struggling, while the party elites are dining out and drinking $10,000 bottles of wine. And people are like, enough of this. We like a recall. Let's try something different. I think, look, it's going to be a tough get to win the recall, even with as much momentum as there is today, because you've got to this will be a battle of the ground game. And this is why it's key to have so many candidates in this race, because ground game is going to be key. And what I mean by that is people walking door to door, ballot harvesting, collecting ballots, encouraging people to vote. Newsom is going to turn out a ton of volunteers. He has a ton of money, and he has the teachers union behind him, which is very powerful in the state, as you both know. And they are going to be walking door to door to try to ballot harvest and try to get this thing as much as they can. And so Republicans and all of these other candidates running who aren't maybe associated with the Republican Party are going to have to come together, sort of like a super PAC, and they're going to have to go out there and they're going to have to walk. They're going to have to get those ballots in. They need to be doing that right now. And if they do, I mean, this could be really close. Again, the momentum is with this movement, but the ground game is going to be key. It's all going to be decided there.
That's such an important point you made. I mean, we talk all the time about the unions and the corruption, the bribe. I call it, it's officially donations. I always just literally call it bribes. That's what it is. They give the money and they get the policy outcomes in return, and actually it's straightforward money. They get the pension, the luxury pensions and healthcare in return. So that's, we know that it's bribery. The unions do, they put the money in, and in exchange they get the policies and the pensions and whatever. But it's not just the money, as you say. It's the muscle. It's the organizing muscle. They love to talk about, get organized, right? And so do you see any sign of the candidates? Because you've got basically, 9 or 10 Republicans who you could say, obviously Larry Elder, clearly the front runner. All the polls show that. And then there's a few others. We had Kevin Kiley on our show. He's doing great. You've got Caitlyn Jenner, you've got John Cox, Kevin Faulconer, like reasonable, plausible candidates, not kind of complete unknowns, but people who you could imagine, being taken seriously. 9 or 10 of those, I guess. Is there any sign that they will come together to kind of at least get the right answer on the first question in terms of that kind of ground game? There's not a lot of time left. What are you hearing?
This is what they have to remember. So oftentimes the Republican Party in California, we spend more energy and time attacking each other than we do keeping an eye on a target, right? And so I think this is what disappointed people about John Cox last time around, is that he spent a lot of time campaigning against Travis Allen when he should have been campaigning against Gavin Newsom. And I think there was some disappointment there. But this is a new John Cox. Certainly Larry Elder brings some new energy to the race. Kevin Kiley, I think, is really key. I was really glad that he got into the race because he brings with him a lot of young energy and a lot of volunteers. He's got about 20 or 30,000 volunteers already. So regardless of whether you think he might have a chance to pull this off, he is going to have that structure that the question one really needs, right? We need those people to go out there and walk around getting people to vote yes on the recall. I think Larry Elder, because he's done such a good job at fundraising, will be able to bring in volunteers. There are a lot of people organizing by him. But my fear is because he got in the race so late, is he going to be able to get that structure up to speed where it needs to be during this process? Because the ballots are already out. And that's another thing I think that's really important to point out. If you listen to Gavin Newsom, every time he talks about this recall, what does he say? He says it's an all mail-in ballot election. That's a lie. You can go and vote on election day. You can go vote for early voting. You can go in person. But for whatever reason, and this is part of that grand scheme that I think everybody's sort of questioning about the mail-in ballots across the country, why does he keep calling it all mail-in when it is not? That's a big piece of information where a lot of listeners that I have to my show have come up to me and said, how do we vote in this thing? Can we come and do it in person? The answer is you can, but for some reason they're not focusing on that. And it's telling, I think.
Well, Jennifer, can you address that a little bit? Because there's been a lot of news reports lately that are troubling about, people stealing ballots. They just found somebody with a gun and drugs passed out, and there are 300 cast ballots in his car. And so people start to get, I think, a little defeated and feel like the fix is in, it's just a cheat. A lot of that Georgia energy I'm hearing in California again. And so, I think it's really important people still actually go to the polls and actually vote. But, what's your take on a lot of the shenanigans going on?
I think there's so many people who just question the system in general, and that's just not in California. That's across the country. I don't know if you guys remember. I think it must have been maybe the second term of Obama. But do you remember that ballot initiative about food labeling? It didn't cost businesses anymore. And it was just about telling people where the food was sourced and what was in it and all of this.
Yeah, I do.
Remember that years ago? everybody that I know that I ever talked to, Republican, Democrat, anywhere in between in the state of California, all supported that. But yet somehow special interests started throwing some money into it. And lo and behold, it got defeated. And ever since then, it's like you kind of question. And then, of course, we had Trump in 2020. We had all of these things where people start questioning the system. And I think that does matter. I think that does suppress the vote. But we also have to tell people that no matter what, no matter where you're coming from, the only thing we have is to get out there and do it, and to be our own advocate, and to watch people, and to listen to people. And if we see things that aren't right, tell a poll worker, tell the registrar of voters. In California, go to California Election Integrity Project, fill out something if you on their website, if you notice that there's something going on. And I think the difference this time around, and this is my optimistic spin on all of this, because I believe when people feel like there's no chance they may not turn out, you have a lot of faith leaders who have come forward. Yeah. A lot of Christians in California did not vote in 2020. They did not vote in 2016. They do not vote because they're playing the long game. We have to remember that no matter where your faith lies, we have a short game in front of us, and we have to vote to make change. And I think that message is finally getting out. You have Pastor Jack Hibbs, who was really integral in getting Larry Elder to come out and get into this election. And I think that's going to make a difference. I think finally, those people who may not have voted before are going to take part in this, because they realize that our kids' future, their education, that's at risk. And that if we don't do something, it's going to be very difficult to stop the slide in 2 or 4 more years.
And it's just that sense that I think it's because it's a recall, and it's on its own, and it's not this kind of complicated thing with the legislative. There's all the different legislative district and the Senate and the Assembly and the governor who does what, whatever. It kind of focuses it, right? It just says, look, I'm pissed off. Right. I think they're getting it wrong. I want a new direction. Mm-hmm. And actually, we know that the governor, I had Larry on my show on Fox this weekend. He knows perfectly well. So does Kevin Kiley. The governor can't do everything on their own. They need the we understand the complexities of actually making policy happen. And you've got the state and local and whatever. But there's something about the fact that it's just this one chance on its own, nothing else around it. And there's no other initiatives and nothing else going on. It's just this one chance. I think that's helpful in kind of making people just feel like, yeah, this is the moment when I say I've had enough.
Right. And it's a chance for change.
That's right. And it's not complicated. I mean, how often do you read ballot initiatives? I think that all three of us are pretty intelligent people, right? You read a proposition, you have to read it 15 times to try to figure out if your yes means no, or if your no means yes. This is pretty straightforward. Do you want to recall Gavin Newsom, yes or no? And to your point, Steve, I think you're absolutely right. I've been calling it a kamikaze mission, because it is very possible that a Republican could win this time. It is very possible that a Republican will sit in office for a year. Because remember, the minute this turns out, and if a Republican is elected, they're going to have to start running for re-election immediately for 2022. And you're going to
exactly.
You're going to have the power of the Democrat Party at the national level just lobbying grenades at you at every turn, because they're not going to want to send the message that the most liberal governor was kicked out of the most liberal state. It's bad for the party on a national level. So the power is going to be there fighting with the Democrat Gavin Newsom this time, but certainly if he loses, whoa, watch out. But I call it a kamikaze mission because it's possible that you may have someone who just flies a plane into Sacramento and drops as many bombs as possible and then may have to get out. And someone like Larry Elder, I think, is well equipped to do that, because he can go in there, he can articulate the problem maybe better than any of the other candidates. He can use executive power. And Kevin Kiley's great at this too, because he knows how the legislature works. But you can't have a candidate, and I'm very wary of any candidate who says that they're going to go in and work with the state legislature, because that's a lie. That is a lie to California. The legislature is going to be out of session. You're going to have to bring them back in. And not one Democrat in the supermajority is going to want to work with the Republican who recalled Gavin Newsom. So you have to have someone who's ready to go in there and shake things up and not be worried about their political future. They have to go in and do what they can do in a short amount of time.
Well, we've got, Larry, we're excited to say that we have Larry on the podcast next episode, so we can ask him about all of this. I mean, but two of the things that really stuck in my mind that he said on the Fox show on Sunday night when I talked to him was that, exactly to your point, he's got, he's pretty, in terms of dropping bombs, like he's got 2 that he said he was going to do right away. And there's a third I will mention. He said, declaration of emergency. So he's going to use the emergency declaration that Newsom has used to sort of, as I put it, actually, when I was reflecting on what Larry said, Newsom's used these emergency declarations to hurt people, to hurt kids and families and small businesses. He's going to use them to help people. So he said he'd use that emergency power on homelessness and wildfires. We had a great episode just now on wildfires and what you can actually do today, rather than just throwing your hands up and saying, oh, it's climate change. There's so much you could do right now to help. And if you've got that emergency declaration, Larry was saying you could do something there. And then the third thing on schools that's really interesting is this ballot initiative that's in the works for real school choice, like basically getting rid of the whole system and just taking all of the money and putting it directly in parents' hands. It's so exciting. That's next year they're aiming for. So that could be the third massive bomb on the whole system.
Yeah. And can I jump in on the emergency powers thing, though? Because that actually worries me. And I'm trying to be intellectually consistent that I don't like it when Gavin inappropriately uses them. And I think Larry Elder needs to be careful throwing that word around, because I think Californians are a little allergic to abuse of emergency authority. Right. That's the power of the legislature. Homelessness and wildfires have been a sustained issue in California that the legislature needs to step up and deal with. That's the purview of the legislature.
I get it, but they're not. But they're not. I mean, it is an emergency. I mean, when you look at what's going on.
Totally. But what I'm worried about is that if there's a Democrat who says wildfires are an emergency, I need emergency powers, climate change is the issue, so now we're going to do shutdowns, and now we're going to wear masks, and now we're going to do all this other nonsense because we're going to try to essentially mitigate climate change. So it's a little bit of a thing that everyone needs to be worried about.
It's a little, and I totally respect being intellectually honest, because we have to get some of that back at some point. But this is a war in the state of California, and we have to fight back with a little bit of what we have been given over the last, the last 20 years in California. But I'll tell you, this pandemic state of emergency was self-created. I mean, the truth is, yes, coronavirus, very serious. You'll not find me. I had it. I recovered from it. It's nothing to mess with. But at the same time, do we need to shut down businesses? Do we need to shut down schools? I think a lot of the emergency that they had to deal with was actually self-created. If we followed the Florida model, I think California may have done a lot better. Instead, we sent a lot of people home, which is where they were getting sick, and we still lost the same, maybe even more lives with a much younger demographic in California than they have in Florida. And so this was a self-created pandemic. Water, homelessness, those are real emergencies that are going on right now. They are by definition needing to be dealt with the state of emergency order. So I think it is a little bit different, because with COVID, I feel like that was very self-inflicted. They told us how bad the problem was so that they could try to fix it, and they fixed it in all the wrong ways. Here we have problems that already exist that we know we have to do something about.
I really agree with that. I really do, because okay. I mean, look at on the wildfires. Let's just talk about that for a second. I mean, that's the definition of an emergency, and you get FEMA involved. E is for emergency, right? Right. And so in FEMA, and so there's no question that it's an emergency. Funnily enough, the Democrats don't want to think of it as an emergency, because they want to think about it as this long-term as an excuse. So last year, do you remember Newsom's response in the middle of the wildfires was making this ridiculous, is one of the two things that really turned me against him, actually, after having been open to thinking, at the start of the pandemic, it's tough for someone in an executive leadership role running a state. I was trying to be supportive. And then the things that I just thought, I can't anymore. The French laundry, we've talked about that. And then the fact that his kids were going to school in private school and everyone else's were.
And he lied about it.
And he lied about it. But then, do you remember right in the middle of the wildfires, he had that, it was just so infuriating. He had this event announcing banning gas cars by 2030. And you just think, everything about that is so dishonest. The idea that first of all, he can't do it because it's the legislature. So it's complete sort of PR stunt. Secondly, it will make absolutely no difference at all to anyone in the state during the time that he's the governor. Thirdly, even if you look at this, even if you sort of, accept everything that they say on climate change, the vehicles on the road, particularly those vehicles, not trucks, will make hardly any difference. You can go on and on. It was a totally dishonest announcement in the middle of an actual emergency.
And what's
just
so frustrating is that they want to push us out of our cars. They want us to go all electric. But can the power grid in California even handle it? My goodness, you have to turn the power off when
exactly.
it gets windy outside, because it will spark a wildfire. So the leadership from Newsom fails over and over and over again. And this is what people see. This is why the recall. But when it comes to wildfires, look, growing up here my whole life, they were never the problem that they were. And we have had weather cycles. Ever. Never the problem. And it's because I can remember I lived in the foothills in Southern California. That's where my mom still lives, has our house that I grew up in. They would come door to door and they would implement fire clearance. And if you didn't do it, they would charge you. You had to do fire clearance. They don't do that anymore because they have the environmental protections. They don't want you trampling on the protected spine flower. And so they stopped all of that forest management, and they laughed when President Trump said, just clean the floors of the forest. He may not have said it in the right ways, but what he is talking about is very real. It's legitimate. And we've stopped doing it because of all of the kowtowing to environmental groups that have taken over and lobbied Gavin Newsom and all the Democrats running Sacramento.
And we don't hold PG&E to account. So Gavin Newsom waived that $200 million fine. That was money that was supposed to go to those 85 people and their families who passed away tragically in the Paradise Fire. And he just, in exchange for a political donation, they don't have to pay anything. There's no consequence for their negligent criminal conduct.
And PG&E,
I'll just say it again. I mean, sorry, Jennifer, just to say, and if anyone's listening, just highly recommend the episode we taped just not long ago with John Keeley from the USGS, who talked through, basically at length, in detail, all the points you're making from an expert perspective about how this is something we can do something about, because it is, especially in the Sierra foothills in the northern part of the state, absolutely about the accumulation of fuel. That is something we can do. That's why an emergency declaration is exactly the right response, because then you can get in there and ignore these ridiculous rules that have stopped us doing the fuel reduction.
And that they've stopped PG&E from operating. Look, PG&E had to spend so much money coming up to code with the environmental standards that they chose not to upgrade their structure, their infrastructure. Jerry Brown, and I'm not sure if he brought that up in that last episode. I'm going to have to listen. Jerry Brown made a deal with PG&E and said, you're going to be on the line for X amount of dollars in liability, or you can update your infrastructure. PG&E, because they had so many things to do to get up to environmental code, said, we're just going to take the risk. If somebody dies or if a town burns down, we'll take the risk, because the liability of that is
cheaper.
It's cheaper than updating all of our infrastructure. And that's something that Jerry Brown put into play. I mean, and then you have Jerry Brown coming out now, who actually sounds sensible compared to Gavin Newsom. So
it does. That's right.
It makes you feel like using it.
Well, I don't know if you've been up in Northern California at all, Jennifer, but if you go over to Lake Tahoe, I mean, talk about the point of people living in the midst of these failed policies. I mean, you can't see the lake. It's literally raining ashes. These are very populated areas that are completely on fire in Northern California. We're not sure our kids are going to go to school. And Gavin's running around saying, it's a Republican power grab. It's so out of touch that even Nancy Pelosi's daughter, Christine Pelosi, said this is not the way to be campaigning. Stop calling it a Republican power grab. It's completely missing the point, which is people are suffering, and you've got to address your actual record in California. But you're right, his record is an absolute tragedy, and so he can't run on it. So he's just got to point the finger everywhere else.
He can't run on it. The only thing that he is touting is a surplus. And anyone who knows California knows that is an inflated surplus that does not take into account the unfunded pension liability that the state has. And so the only thing he's ever been able to talk about is that. And why do we have such a budget surplus? Not only the pensions that he's not taking into account, but the amount of taxes that are coming from California that he is not putting to good use. And when we talk about fires and we talk about issues facing California, water is incredibly important to all of this, because we need water to fight fires. Now we have counties and municipalities that may be out of water in just a mere couple of months. I mean, this is incredible. When you look at look at a city like Phoenix, or look at a state like Arizona, what they've done is they've captured water underneath the ground. If you want to talk infrastructure and creating jobs in California for something that really matters, this is the way to do it. It's, less environmental protections, more of this good infrastructure. And California could be on its road to recovery in no time if we got
Totally.
serious about this.
And if you had a vision of how to make it all work, and you talk about desalination, which they don't even consider. I mean, look
Right.
at the end, and then nuclear power, which could fuel that, but of course they're dead against nuclear power because I don't know why, because it's completely carbon free, and that's supposedly what they want. But for some sort of ideological reason, it's all got to be wind and solar. So exactly as you said earlier, they're trying to make us more dependent on electricity. Just at the exact same time, they're making the electricity less dependable. I mean, the whole thing is it's just so ridiculous. And that's why it's so cool, actually, I think, that people are kind of waking up to because there's nothing, if you look at all these intersecting problems, they're just sort of completely incompetent on all of them, and it's all just virtue signaling. That's the thing I think is so kind of defining about these Democrats today. These kind of it's all. And California is such a great example. It's just the virtue signal. We're woke, we're social justice, this, that, and the other, saying the right things, climate. But actually, in terms of governance, in terms of actually running things, getting policies that help people, they're totally incompetent and clueless.
It's unbelievable. And how they've miscalculated all of this. And this is almost the beauty of this movement, is that while they're talking about, Gavin Newsom is talking about this being an extremist issue or white supremacy, or, this is just right-wing tactics and Trump supporters trying to recall him, they totally misunderstand that people in California are waking up. And I say, bring it on. I mean, the more they miscalculate the problem, the better it is for us to make real change in the state. Forget the politics. Let's talk about the real issues that are facing California. Let's get someone in there who can actually do something about those problems. And probably that person isn't a traditional politician that wants to have this lifelong income coming in from pretending to solve the problems.
Yeah.
This guy's like a mob boss. I mean, I really feel like the state was all of a sudden run by a mob boss, and you got to pay the VIG's Gavin, you got to write your check in order to get whatever political favor back, all this pay to play, the behested payments. It's so corrupt. We have a legitimate mafia running California, and people have got to run to the ballot box and say, enough. We want good, decent leaders.
And it's come from the fact that they haven't been challenged. That's why this is so important.
So true.
Because it's the complacency that comes from thinking, well, I'm going to never lose my election. Look at the vote. You got the voter registration numbers. Look at all the polls that show it's a very blue state. That sense of complacency. It's just like any, like in a business, if there's no competition, if it's a political monopoly, that's a disaster. And if it's a business monopoly, it is too. But what we're seeing now is that actually that was all very superficial, that people didn't really buy into it. They just didn't see a way to escape from it. And that's what this recall is providing.
It really is. And if you look at, I mean, people are waking up, not just in this race, but all over the state. I mean, you have people like Adam Schiff, you have people who are in Congress who've been Maxine Waters, who brand names, right? They get elected time and time again, and no one has really challenged them. I feel like this recall movement will actually maybe start enticing people who are great quality candidates to go in there. Yeah. Maybe they're even Democrats. Maybe they're independents. Maybe some of them will be Republican, who are going to go in with common sense ideas and real plans, because I think people are ready to hear it. It's just gone on too long. There are too many problems, and people's quality of life, it's starting to suffer. I mean, the fact that more people are leaving California than coming in, that's a story in and of itself.
Exactly. Well, imagine that, imagine real people with real plans and competence to execute them actually getting into power. Can you imagine? Well, if there's, if there's one thing we can take from this conversation, I think that is truly at the heart of this. That's really what this is all about. Is actually is not political. It's this basic kind of frustration with utter incompetence on the part of the people who are supposed to be in charge. I think we're out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. How great was that? What fun. First time we've met, Jennifer. I really enjoyed that. It was great to see you.
You guys are fantastic. I'm so happy that you're doing this. California needs the attention, and I can't wait to listen every new episode. Yeah, exactly. And I hope you can join us again as we watch this recall and its aftermath. And we're here for the long term, because whatever happens with the recall, these issues aren't going away. This movement isn't going away, and we'll be there hopefully to help build it and help it along. Thanks, Jennifer. Good to see you. What happens in California goes to the rest of the country, right? Thank you, guys.
Well said.
All right. Well, that was a great conversation. Thank you to Jennifer Horn. Thanks, Kristen Garcia-Dumont, for being with us. And thank you for listening to this episode of California Rebel Base. Make sure you subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a 5-star review. That really helps us get the word out. As you can see, there's a lot going on. Crucial weeks ahead leading up to the recall. Guess who's here next episode? Only Larry Elder. You can't miss that. Join us at California Rebel Base.